When Captain America: The Winter Soldier came out, the reception of the film could be summed up in one singular word: improvement. The praise towards the Russo brothers and the writers stems from them taking the aspects that were apparent in his previous two appearances, emphasising the more well-received traits and removing aspects that weren't as well-received. In the previous films, while his enhanced speed and strength was put on show for the audience, it was not used to its full extent, with the initial chase scene of him sprinting after a car and punching the hatch open probably as being the greatest showcasing of his enhanced abilities in those films. The rest of the time was him merely throwing his shield or slightly battering people to the side. The super aspect of this superhuman was heavily downplayed, with him fighting aliens in hand-to-hand combat not being as impressive as it had the potential to be. This film changed that. It made it quite clear that the feats he does in this film, even the ones where he requires the use of the shield for help, are only possible because of his status as a super soldier. Skydiving into the water using his shield, knocking people down in a single hit, smashing through doors and walls during chase scenes, with him accidentally denting a wall because of the mere fact that he lost his balance. He takes on over a dozen men armed with advanced technology and manages to throw them all around like ragdolls, taking down a Quinjet single-handedly, and of course, his fights with the Winter Soldier. The main bad guy that Cap had to deal with in the past was a superhuman supremacist that believed the strong should be in charge of the world and that they were destined to rule it, as those that aren't them are weak, and despite the hammy performance, there wasn't much else to Red Skull that I can point to that provides depth. In this film, the overarching main bad guy is a man who believes that there needs to be a level of order enforced by fear, as at the moment mankind is too focused on tearing down what holds their society up to help improve it, and so wishes to use weapons to remove threats from the world order and bring in a new era of peace, one enforced by fear. Meanwhile, the more active bad guy of the film is Cap's longtime best friend, now brainwashed beyond his actions and used as a deadly assassin, being a foil to everything he stands for. And Cap has to struggle with the fact that he will most likely be involved in a fight that he desperately wants to avoid. The film also does a good job with Natasha. We get to see how Natasha has started to rely less on orders and her loyalty to Fury and more on what she thinks is morally right. In Iron Man 2, it was revealed that she ultimately was just following orders, expressing pure professionalism and shrugging off the more morally dubiousness of her tricking Tony and his allies. In the first half of the Avengers, we see the same thing, with Natasha using a child in order to get what she wants, and using her skills to trick Loki into a confession when pretending her guard is down. Except we learn later that Natasha losing her composure wasn't part of her plan, but she did in fact lose control over her emotions. She reflects to Clint later that she's scared of losing everything that she's been given in her new life. From this film onward, she becomes a lot more open to the people in her life, starting with Fury and Cap in this film, and continuing on all the way until Endgame. The fight scenes in this film also seem a lot more intense. Sometimes the fight scenes feel like there's a little too many cuts in them, but most of the time they're coherent and you understand what's going on. Not that these don't have their flaws, however. My main complaint for the fights is pretty much that every time you see an unarmed combatant take on people with guns, the people with guns will just slowly walk towards them so they can get taken out instead of just shooting their guns. This usually wouldn't be too bad, but as I mentioned in my John Wick video, when you have a series that heavily relies on guns in action scenes, having opponents slowly walk up to the protagonist instead of just using guns from a distance, like a normal person would, is very distracting, and this movie features a lot of guys with guns. The CGI is also an improvement. There's a lot of good acting and emotional moments. The pacing is decent and it feels like a film where the world building and the consequences of it are felt in a later film, which I think most other MCU films struggle to do. Unfortunately, despite all the praise I've just heaped on this film, the actual plot really doesn't hold up under a careful eye, and while I heavily enjoy it and I don't get bored from watching it, I do think it's not as great as people think it is, especially when it comes to establishing the mythology of the Winter Soldier and the world building of Hydra, as well as some questionable character arcs. From the start, the movie doesn't make sense. Towards the end of the film, the heroes release S.H.I.E.L.D's database to the world so that Hydra will have no assets or personnel that they can hide from it. Which means that the movie shouldn't have even happened because Tony Stark has already decoded the entire S.H.I.E.L.D. database in the previous film, and yet he doesn't try to inform Fury or Cap about it, and there's no reference or foreshadowing to Hydra being a part of S.H.I.E.L.D. in that movie. The directors themselves even mention that this is a glaring issue.
Why didn't Tony Stark find out about Hydra when he decrypted all of S.H.I.E.L.D's files? How did an agency that employs thousands of people...
In the opening of the movie, Cap and the team are on a mission to rescue a S.H.I.E.L.D. vessel from terrorists. On On top of some weird physics, we have a scene that I feel betrays what we know about Steve Rogers for the sake of doing something cool. In the first film, Steve makes his opinion on power and violence very clear.
I don't want to kill anyone. I don't like bullies.
Steve fought in the war, and he killed in the war, but he did so because he wanted to stop the fighting. He wanted to stop unnecessary deaths. He did what he had to do, but most importantly, he took prisoners when he could. Throughout this scene, there's several instances where Steve merely engages the enemy, knocks them unconscious, and then leaves, allowing these people to be taken prisoner. But there's also several times when he has the drop on his opponents, could easily knock them out and move on, yet goes out of his way to kill them instead. The first instance of this is in this fight scene. He comes across 3 guards stood together. This guard quickly turns around and is completely unprepared to take him on, but instead of just knocking him out as he does with the other 2 in a moment, he chooses to kick the guard so hard his back shatters against the rail of the ship, breaking the guard's spine and letting them drop into the ocean to slowly drown to death. Immediately following this, there's another guard who is leaning against the rails and is unaware of Cap being there, but instead of just giving a quick sucker punch and knocking him out, Steve chooses to throw him into the stormy sea below, once again drowning someone he could have just knocked unconscious and taken prisoner. Moving on, we see scenes of Steve trying to adjust to modern life, him arguing with Fury over the new helicarriers, and Fury talking to his boss, Pierce, to stop the carriers from launching while he investigates some encrypted files that don't make any sense. Hydra, who understands the importance of being patient and operating in secrecy, who are on the verge of achieving 3 war machines that could neutralize any enemy on the planet they want, decide that the best course of action to remove Nick from the investigation is to very publicly have 4 vehicles ram his car and shoot his vehicle with assault rifles in the middle of the day, in the middle of one of the biggest cities in the US, using technology far more advanced than what normal police have access to. Something that will very obviously be seen and recorded on the news, possibly even alerting other people in S.H.I.E.L.D. that something is wrong. During Fury's escape, we then get onto my next problem. The Winter Soldier and how he's presented in this film. The soldier is supposed to be a boogeyman in the Secret Service circles, a man that most people, even those high up in the spy networks, don't even think he exists because the feats and kills performed by him don't seem feasible for one man to pull off. He has been showing up for nearly 60 years, quickly neutralizing any and all targets in the nearby area and then leaving without a trace, which is why most people don't believe he exists, because there's no actual evidence showing he does, which is then juxtaposed to him casually standing in the middle of the street in broad daylight, in front of all these people and all these security cameras, who chooses to use a grenade launcher to very loudly blow up a car. Then, instead of quickly neutralizing the target and leaving, he chooses to slowly walk towards his target to finish him off, allowing Fury to escape. Later, he successfully shoots Fury, and instead of immediately taking off after hitting him, he proceeds to just stand around on the roof for another 30 seconds doing nothing, allowing Steve to catch up to him and confirm his existence for himself. And of course, there's the highway fight scene. That also has similar issues of his very public handling of the matters. These scenes are incompatible with what we were told about the character. You can't tell us that this is an individual who is essentially a ghost that is so covert and so efficient that people aren't even sure that they exist, and then have pretty much all of their scenes show them as a figure that is constantly exposing himself to the public eye and struggling to eliminate a 65-year-old man who's already injured. So Fury escapes, tries to warn Steve, gets shot, gives him the files. Steve pursues the Winter Soldier until he magically vanishes. Fury apparently dies on the operating table, and now Steve needs somewhere safe to store the files. Steve, using his brain, decides to hide it in a vent or one of the ceiling panels, right? Wrong. He hides it in a vending machine. Literally the only thing between some fuckwit on the street and some heavily encrypted files belonging to one of the biggest organizations on the planet is 3 packets of Hubba Bubba. Natasha even points this out later, but she shouldn't need to point this out because it's very obviously a dumb thing to do, especially when it isn't even this well hidden. If Steve was worried that he was being watched and needed somewhere quick to hide it, he could have easily just excused himself to the bathroom instead of doing whatever this was. I'm also not sure how Natasha knew to investigate the vending machine in the first place either, considering that she had left before Steve tried to hide anything, but whatever. Steve talks to Pierce about the possible files and the threats inside of S.H.I.E.L.D., and then the elevator fight happens. Steve wins, escapes, is made a wanted man, he meets up with Natasha, and they decide to try and decrypt the files and find out what's going on. They do this by randomly wandering into an Apple store, putting the files into a basic laptop that would absolutely have the bare minimum on it and definitely wouldn't have any spy software used to decrypt files, and then somehow manage to hack these files that Fury couldn't get into in less than 9 minutes. I understand the importance of product placement, but you didn't need to simp for Apple this hard, my guys, especially for such an important plot point. The two go to the coordinates that the files gave them, the old army bunker that Steve went to, and after noticing something out of place with the structural placements, they discover a hidden shield bunker and a computer that houses the consciousness of Arnim Zola. He explains to them that after the war, the US accepted Nazi scientists into the country to do work for them, and from this they managed to spread Hydra inside various US organizations, including SHIELD. Now, Arnim Zola is a pretty smart guy. He was the head scientist in charge of Hydra. He knew that defecting to the US was the most logical course of action, and he was able to secretly grow Hydra inside of the US and its various organizations for several decades before his biological body died. He seemingly has access to the outside world, as he is able to pull up documents showing Fury listed as KIA and makes mock-ups of Steve on the posters of magazines having been branded a traitor, showing that he is aware of everything that has happened over the past few days. So he would know that these two are threats to Hydra's goals. He has their attention by drip feeding information, and he would be aware that Hydra is now trying to drop a missile on them right now. If this character had any sort of consistency, then he would keep the two distracted long enough for the missile to hit them, neutralizing the two main opponents standing in Hydra's way and ensuring that the long-term goals that he devoted his life and afterlife to would be successful. Unfortunately, because the movie needs these two to survive, the patient, crafty, cunning man who wants these two dead decides to alert them that something is wrong and that they're about to die, allowing them to plan a way to survive the missile they are now alerted to. They survive the missile, and so the Winter Soldier shows up at Pierce's house, revealing that Pierce is a Hydra agent. Steve and Nat go to Sam's house for shelter, and he decides to join them in their goal to stop S.H.I.E.L.D. The trio kidnap and interrogate Sitwell, a high-ranking agent in S.H.I.E.L.D., who reveals that the whole point of Project Insight is to analyze the characteristics of individuals around the world and eliminate those that can oppose Hydra's goals before they can act, essentially removing the threat before the person even knows they'll become a threat. We then get the highway scene. On top of the problem I already mentioned about how public the Winter Soldier is being, the next main issue is how this scene unfolds in general. Hydra wishes to eliminate everyone in this car, yet instead of targeting Sam and removing the driver of the vehicle, making everyone else vulnerable, or just using some sort of explosives to blow up the car, the Winter Soldier seemingly teleports out of nowhere and conveniently only kills the one person the audience doesn't care about, allowing the heroes to live and be alert for the rest of the fight. The Winter Soldier is thrown off the car, a Hydra Humvee rams into the back of the heroes, and the Winter Soldier jumps back onto the car. Now, I would say that he should just use his gun to shoot the heroes who are stuck in the car, but apparently the Russos pulled a Last Jedi and digitally removed the gun in post-production, as he is clearly still holding it until it magically vanishes in this shot. On top of this, even this bad editing choice doesn't excuse him not shooting the heroes here, because he has a scorpion attached to his back and another pistol, which he could have easily used to kill them instead of randomly ripping the steering wheel out. So they eventually escape the vehicle and Steve is hit by a grenade launcher, and I get that he is a superhero and all that, but shouldn't all of this at least injure him? Because he shows back up later absolutely no worse for wear. On top of this, the highly specialised Hydra agents choose to walk very slowly clustered in a group with no cover, spraying all their ammo at absolutely nothing, forcing them to be unable to flank the heroes, and constant reloads stop them from shooting them when they're out of cover. The Winter Soldier decides to chase after Nat, and everyone else chooses to focus their attention on Steve. Despite shooting at him a solid 2 minutes ago, every single one of these guys just forgets about Sam, who manages to sneak behind and kill one of the guys that randomly chose to not jump down when the rest of the group did, allowing Sam to get a gun and help take them out. Once again, no one decides to shoot Steve in the legs. They all choose to shoot at the giant indestructible shield instead. Nat manages to distract and delay the Winter Soldier long enough for Steve to catch up and engage him in combat. And after a brutal fight, Steve knocks his mask off, revealing it to be Bucky. Now, while this is a dramatic moment for both Steve and the audience, it isn't for Bucky. He doesn't care about doing anything but completing his mission. So him choosing to just stand there not doing anything long enough for for Sam to get the drop on him is a bit of an odd thing for him to do. More Hydra agents show up, but are unable to kill them as they are in public, and so decide to load them up into a prisoner transport and take them away from the public eye. Then, instead of just killing them in the transport, they decide to take them all the way to some abandoned alley to have them killed, which allows Maria Hill to rescue them. And I have no idea how she does this. They open the door and there's a hole in the transport, showing that they used the cutting device Fury used earlier. There's two scenarios here and neither of them make sense. The first one is that they cut a hole as they were on their way to the location. This doesn't make sense because as soon as they drop down they would be run over by the vehicles behind them, or at least the vehicles behind them would alert the others that they're escaping. The second scenario is that they escaped as soon as the transport stopped. This means that over the course of 15 seconds, they cut a hole in the transport, drop down, cut a hole in the concrete, and then everyone somehow managed to drop down before the doors opened. On top of this, you would also have all of the noise and bright flashes associated with cutting, which apparently no one here sees or hears as they make their way to open the doors. As I said, this escape is nonsensical, they just teleport out of the scene. The group arrive at a hideout Hill is using, and we discover that Nick Fury is still alive, having apparently used a drug to slow his heart rate down to 1 beat per minute. So Fury should just be brain damaged, right? I understand his body wouldn't need as much oxygen if he's literally just lying on a table asleep, but 1 beat a minute would mean basically no oxygen is going to his brain, which on top of his already catastrophic blood loss and organ failures would cause his brain cells to die. But no, apparently he is completely fine and suffers no side effects after this. The team regroup, start a plan to hijack the helicarrier, and then Steve gets his old uniform back from the museum. The plan starts by the group taking control of the communication center and broadcasting a message trying to get the helicarrier launch stopped, which I think is problematic for two reasons. The first is that they now lose the element of surprise. We see in the movie that all they need to do is plug in their own drives into the computer network to take control. They somehow manage to sneak into S.H.I.E.L.D. to reach the communication center. So I don't understand how, alongside using the digital face technology, they wouldn't be able to sneak into the helicarriers and take control of at least one of them before someone notices something is amiss. Afterwards, at least one of the helicarriers would be under their control by the time the conflict starts. And Hill still could have played a pre-recorded message afterwards, rallying the people to Cap's cause while only needing to take down 2 helicarriers. Secondly, Cap alerts all of S.H.I.E.L.D. that some of the agents are actually Hydra, causing a mass panic in the building. Hydra knows who to fight, but the regular S.H.I.E.L.D. agents are completely clueless about who they can trust, being paranoid over Hydra and S.H.I.E.L.D. agents alike. They are extremely hesitant and confused over who they're fighting, with Sam even pointing this out. As such, many of them are killed in the confusion. The heroes could have come up with a plan to evacuate the building and get the majority of the S.H.I.E.L.D. agents out, but Cap chooses to be as blunt as possible, causing Hydra to start to purge as many people as they need to in their quest to get the helicarriers in the air, deaths that could have been avoided. So, the group begins to take over the helicarriers, fully aware that they are facing up against automatic weapons, big open spaces, and long distance combat. Can someone explain to me why Steve doesn't bother to bring a gun with him? He has no problem with killing, and he has no problem with using guns, yet for some reason he chooses to rush into combat scenarios without a gun when he is most likely facing targets at long range. And it's only thanks to the fact that they only shoot his shield and keep running up to him that he's able to advance throughout the helicarriers. Had they displayed a level of competency, he would have been done for. As Steve is fighting on one helicarrier, Falcon starts to make his way to the other. And instead of just landing on it and doing his job, he chooses to fly over the helicarrier, activating its anti-air weapons which begin to track him, forcing him to waste time trying to outmaneuver them to the point where when he is finally able to get onto a helicarrier, a Quinjet is able to catch up to him and delay him even longer. It's a bit strange for someone who specialises in air combat to deliberately put themselves in a position where anti-air weapons can target them, almost like this movie makes him incompetent at his job in order to add a chase scene and pad the runtime. As Cap continues to take on squadrons of soldiers that keep deciding to walk up to him instead of using their guns, Nat has disguised herself as one of the defense secretaries that Pierce had taken hostage, allowing her to dispose of the guards and take Pierce hostage, before she starts to dump all of S.H.I.E.L.D.'s files onto the internet, which would by extension flush out all the information on how Hydra is operating. With Cap and Sam both taking control of their helicarriers, they move on to the third, landing together and making their way to the control center. As they do, they are encountered by the Winter Soldier, who, instead of using his grenade launcher, or a machine gun, or his scorpion, chooses to punch them instead, taking Sam out of the fight but failing to kill either of them, allowing Cap to continue his mission and leading to the two fighting in the data center. Meanwhile, Fury arrives to assist Nat in decrypting the files, using his and Pierce's alpha level clearance to start dumping the files. And then, and I cannot stress this enough, Nat, Fury, and the other defense secretaries choose to just stand around and do absolutely nothing as Pierce picks up his phone, allowing him to detonate the name badges and kill the secretaries. They're all just stood looking at this holographic screen that says files decrypting instead of keeping an eye on the mass murdering lunatic next to them. It's just a completely stupid scene. As Sam delays Rumlow from assisting Pierce, Cap manages to defeat Bucky and take the card to the third data center, although he is shot and heavily injured. This allows Hill to make the Helicarriers target each other, taking down Project Insight, the Hydra forces, as well as any SHIELD agents or civilians unlucky enough to be in the fallout zone. Pierce attempts to leave with Nat, but she stuns herself and the explosive name tag, making Pierce unable to activate it and allowing Fury to kill him. As the final Helicarrier begins to crash, Rumlow is caught under the rubble and Sam is forced to run, leaping out of a window and into a helicopter flown by Fury. And for some reason, Nat is now fully dressed up in her tactical gear and doesn't seem to be suffering any after effects of a taser that has been knocking people unconscious throughout all these movies. Steve helps the trapped Bucky from the debris, but Bucky continues to fight, still being under the brainwashing influence. As he attempts to kill him, Steve refuses to fight back and causes Bucky to hesitate. The helicarrier then falls apart, causing Steve to fall into the water and nearly drown. He is rescued from drowning by Bucky, leaving Steve on the nearby shoreline before disappearing. As Steve recovers in a hospital, Nat is forced in front of a committee to answer about what happened to SHIELD and whether she should be held accountable for the loss of one of their most valuable assets, with Nat arguing that while people like her can make the world vulnerable, they can also help the world against people like them, with Nat seeing herself as an asset against Hydra and others who would like to cause harm to the world. After faking his death, Fury asks Sam and Steve to come with him to Europe to try and hunt down the rest of Hydra's forces that fled, with the two refusing, instead choosing to try and find Bucky, who is slowly becoming more conscious and piecing his past together. All the while we see Hydra forces and Sokovia experimenting with two super soldier individuals. So this film is a bit of a mess, huh? I've already been over issues with the plot, but now let's look at how some of the other sections of the story struggle because of it. For a start, the character arcs. Don't worry, this segment is going to be really short because the only character arc that is good and works is Nat's. As mentioned, this film continues her journey on being a more emotional and trustworthy to those around her. And while she still starts the film being secretive around Steve, throughout the movie she chooses to rely and trust him more instead of working in secret by herself, ultimately culminating in her releasing all of her secrets and misdeeds around the globe because it's the right thing to do. Now on to the others. None of the villains have any arcs, none of the side characters have any arcs, and Sam is a chilled, relaxed guy who likes to help people and is exactly the same at the end of the movie. So, Steve and Fury. Towards the end of the film, we see Fury help Nat release the files for SHIELD all over the internet, which would essentially destroy the organisation and reveal any allies and resources he has for others to snatch up for themselves. And for the life of me, I have no idea why he does this. He doesn't want SHIELD to go down. Hell, he still doesn't really have an ethical problem with Project Insight up towards the start of the final battle. He seemingly wants to remove Hydra and retake control of SHIELD, but then Steve gives him a pep talk and apparently everything good that SHIELD has done is worthless and he's just going to take down his entire organisation, instead of just looking up at the Hydra files and using SHIELD's resources to hunt them down, randomly choosing to destroy his entire life's work because the movie says he has to. And I know what you're thinking. What do you mean Nat's the only person with a good character arc? Steve's arc is really good, why am I not praising that? And the answer to that is he doesn't have an arc. Seriously, I've got no idea where he used to be on the right side and then he has to deal with the fact that the people he's working for might not be as moral as he is sentiment for this film has come from. In the first Avenger, Steve does what is morally right and stands against his government when he thinks they're wrong. In the Avengers, Steve does what is morally right and stands against the government when he thinks they're wrong. In this film, Steve does what is morally right and stands against the government when he thinks they're wrong. One of Steve's first official acts as Captain America is to disobey a direct order from his commanding officer and doing the right thing, regardless of the personal consequences. And that's all he does in this film as well. He stands against SHIELD, who he later learns is Hydra, because he doesn't trust them to do the right thing and refuses to back down regardless of the consequences. He has no arc, he's just the same guy. Which is fine, by the way. I like Steve as a character. I just wish people would stop going on as if he has some sort of great arc in this film when nothing really exists. And while we're talking about defying the government, this film and the political weight it could hold is heavily watered down as soon as it becomes apparent that the bad guys are not SHIELD, but Hydra. Ignoring the massive plot hole created from this decision, it just seems kinda lazy and forced so the heroes don't have any questionable decisions. If it was Cap actually taking a stand against the US, that could be a good avenue to explore ideas of morality and trust in the government, and focusing on the concept of to be lawful or to be good. But then this is all sucked out of the window because they're actually fighting against a secret Nazi cult, so there's actually zero issues with fighting against them. It's just so lazy. As is the messaging of Project Insight. Project Insight is 3 heavily armed helicarriers that can be used to eliminate anyone at any time anywhere across the globe at a flick of a switch. The stance that the movie seems to want us to take is the stance our hero has, that we can't punish people before they commit a crime, and you can't just hold a gun to the planet and say that it's okay because you're protecting people. Hydra wanting to be able to do what it wants without answering to an authority or worrying about the law and morality is their primary goal throughout the movie, but the film itself seems confused about whether it truly believes Project Insight is despicable or not. At one point in the film, we get this scene.
What if Pakistan marched into Mumbai tomorrow, and you knew that they were going to drag your daughters into a soccer stadium for execution, and you could just stop it with a flick of the switch? Wouldn't you? Wouldn't you all?
Not if it was your switch.
Okay, so you're perfectly fine with Project Insight, you just don't like the fact that Pierce is in charge of it. If Fury took control of S.H.I.E.L.D. and he wiped out anyone who threatened you, you would be okay with that? It's the exact same with the opening, where Cap just goes around randomly killing who he wants and knocking others unconscious, making us question why some of them deserved to die and others didn't. The morality and ethics that the movie is trying to get across just comes along as disjointed and murky. Overall, despite still being an enjoyable film and still having lots of good elements to it, The Winter Soldier is a movie that is full of contrivances and idiotic moments just to justify the plot. The politics of the movie are as confusing as they are shallow. Most of the fights rely too much on quick editing to hide the fact that most of the enemies could just shoot Cap and end the movie immediately. There are basically no character arcs, and of the 2 that there are, one of them doesn't make any sense. And in the end, we're left with some very surface level villains that could have been interesting and provided questions for the audience to contemplate in the real world. Instead, they're just Nazis. Thanks for watching, lads and lasses. If you enjoyed this video, please consider liking, subscribing and checking out some of my other videos. Sharing always helps, and if you're feeling really generous, please consider my Patreon or YouTube membership. I also have a Twitter and occasionally I do live streams. But most of all, I just hope you had a great day and hopefully I will see you in the next video.